Hi, everyone. I'm Thomas Murray Dawson with Center for Political Education. I'm joining you from the occupied lands of the Ohlone people in the East Bay of California. As always, we encourage all our participants located in the Bay Area to pay their Shumi land tax, which you can do by following the link in the chat. Speaking of the chat, it will be disabled for these calls, except for us to share information with the audience. If you have questions you'd like to get answered during the call, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. In that same toolbar, you can find the CC button to enable closed captioning. We are also grateful to have ASL interpreters on hand throughout this call. On behalf of CPE, Bay Resistance, Arab Resource and Organizing Center, and the Anti-Police Terror Project, thank you for joining the second of our weekly PSA calls, or Palestine Solidarity Announcements. These calls are a space for us to provide you with weekly updates on what's happening in Palestine, the most recent calls to action, and ways organizations, activists, and other supporters can join the ongoing solidarity work for Palestine in the Bay Area. Today's agenda is as follows. First, somatics practitioner and organizer with Families for Ceasefire, Melissa Fan, will lead us in a short somatics grounding practice. Next, we'll hear from Samar Arabi from Arab Resource and Organizing Center with updates from on the ground in Gaza and recent political developments. Then we'll hear from Connie Cho from Asian Pacific Environmental Network about recent actions and how organizers can continue to put pressure on Congress. Lily Fossey Haskell from Critical Resistance will discuss the prosecutions against the Bay Bridge 78 and how we can continue our support for them in the weeks ahead. Finally, we'll hear from Rafilwe from APTP on what's happening with Reclaim MLK during January. And then we'll close out with Michelle Mascarenas to share a strategic overview of what's ahead as we enter the next week of critical action for ceasefire and a new calendar year. Finally, we'll share a link to a separate Zoom that you can join after this call if you want to discuss with organizers additional questions or figure out other ways for you to be more involved in the work. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to growing the fight for Palestine together with you in the days and weeks ahead. Before I hand it over to Melissa, I want to end by reciting a poem from Palestinian scholar and activist Rafat al-Arir, who was assassinated by the Israeli government just weeks ago, and whose words remind us poignantly of our obligations to those who've been martyred and those who still survive in Palestine. The poem is entitled, If I Must Die. If I must die. If I must die, you must live. To tell my story, to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth and some strings, make it white with a long tail, so that a child somewhere in Gaza, while looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dad who left in a blaze, and bid no one farewell, not even to his flesh, not even to himself, sees the kite, my kite you made, flying up above, and thinks for a moment, an angel is there, bringing back love. If I must die, let it bring hope. Let it be a tale. Thank you all again for joining us. And with that, I'll hand it over to Melissa.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Thomas, so much for reciting that poem. We're going to start with a short somatic grounding today so that we can be in full access of our agency, so that we can act from a place of intentionality and purpose connected to our values, and not from a place of unconscious dysregulation. Collective liberation requires collective embodiment. It's not separate from our movements for social change. It's integral. So today I'm going to share 3 really quick practices that you can do at any time whenever you're feeling overwhelmed, whenever you notice you're feeling dysregulated, whenever you notice that maybe you're feeling desensitized, or if you're in a frozen place. So the first one that I'm going to show you involves our hands. And so I'll demonstrate it for you first. So you're going to have one hand, one palm, and trace the outline of your palm with the index finger of your other hand. And doing this at a slow to medium pace, you can look at your own palm while you're doing this. Just going to do this 2 times on each hand. Switching to the other hand. And just notice if it feels different in your body after having done that very simple practice. And so the next practice I'm going to show you involves gaze and vision. And if you're able to, I invite you to find a spot in front of you. If you can not look at the screen, that would be great. And if you have to look at the screen, just that's okay too. And begin to soften your gaze. And switch to your peripheral vision. Noticing the room at the edges of your vision. Noticing what is at the very top of your vision. On the left and right sides. And on the very bottom. And try to extend your peripheral vision further than you ever have before. Almost as if you could see behind you. When we switch to peripheral vision, we are telling our nervous systems that we are safe. The last practice I'm going to share with you is a heart-based practice. So I'm going to invite you to place one hand or both hands on your heart. And taking some time to breathe into your heart. Imagine a color that is calming and soothing for you. And you can close your eyes or soften your gaze. And imagine this color filling up your heart. Radiating out to the rest of your body. Thank you, everybody, for joining me in this practice. Hand it back to you, Thomas.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And now we'll hear from Samar from Iraq on some updates on in what's happening in Gaza, and then also some political developments.
Oh, thanks so much, Thomas. My name is Samer. I'm a member of the Arab Resource and Organizing Center. I use he, they pronouns. I just want to give a quick update. Let me share my screen here on the situation on the ground and some associated political context. Just to give a quick high-level run through of what I'd like to talk about today. I sort of want to start zoomed in about what's happening in Gaza, zoom out a bit to what's happening in Palestine generally, then the region, a quick assessment of what's happening internationally, and then zoom back in here to talk about what's happening at the national level in the US and what's happening in the Bay Area. There's a lot, and there isn't a lot of time, and I do want to acknowledge off the bat that 10 minutes is not enough to cover the totality of a world-changing event and unimaginable levels of genocide and ethnic cleansing. So please don't consider this a comprehensive overview of everything that's happened this past week, but rather an assessment of things that have stood out to me. And I'd be happy to talk about other pieces of it or to go into any of it in more detail later. But right now, I'm just going to run through some things. So at a very high level, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the scale and scope of death and destruction that continues to happen across Gaza, where this week the official death count has passed 20,000 people, which includes, I think, at least 8,000 children. And the number of displaced is now, I think, nearing 2 million, with half of the infrastructure of Gaza in terms of people's homes and basic public infrastructure is destroyed. There's a lot of specific statistics on this slide that I will share with you all after this presentation if you want to dig into any of it in more detail. The bombings and large-scale displacement and evacuation of Palestinians in Gaza continues unabated. In many ways, this past week has been one of the worst. As has been the case, Israel continues to push Palestinians out of particular areas to continue bombing campaigns, but then those have very little relation to where people are actually safe. So the places where people are being evacuated are themselves military targets. And the scope of what areas are considered safe and unsafe continues to change, sometimes multiple times per day. And that's something that even Western media is picking up on at this point. There's been an acknowledged attempt to sort of destroy the underlying agricultural infrastructure of Gaza using starvation as a weapon of war, which is obviously a war crime. And now several UN documented events that have led to, that have noted the summary execution of people in public areas, often in front of their families, with no sort of underlying justification beyond the sort of, I don't know, bloodlust, you might call it. I think people tend to focus a lot on the military casualties of this conflict because they are horrifying, but I do think it's important to take a moment to acknowledge the sort of broader impacts in Gaza, both in terms of food security and broader health. When we talk about the number of dead and the number of injured, we are talking about a very conservative estimation. And the long-term morbidity and mortality of the people in Gaza is something that's an ongoing concern that is growing every week, that access to basic supplies, including food and clean drinking water, continues to diminish. As for the on-the-ground situation of the Israeli military, it continues to be, extremely violent, and the number of Israeli casualties themselves are growing quite a bit. The deadliest week, according to the Israeli government, of its offensive in Gaza was this past 10 days, including one attack in the north of Gaza that had claimed to be fully secured by the Israeli military a month ago, where 10 soldiers died in a single conflagration. There is not time to discuss here why all the casualties that are being reported by the Israeli military are high-level military officials. You can see here that the lowest ranked person is a sergeant, but if that's something you all want to discuss, that's something we can discuss maybe in question and answer. I think there's some fascinating implications of that, along with the ages of these people. In addition to the outward military engagements, probably the biggest news in terms of the foibles of Israel's occupation army in Gaza this week was the murdering of 3 Israeli hostages that were killed by the IDF in a way that, if you haven't been following the news, is almost unimaginable. 3 Israelis who had put up giant signs on a house that said SOS, hostages here, came out shirtless and waving a white flag. 2 of them were summarily executed. The 3rd ran back into a building and was chased down and murdered. So the outcry against this ongoing conflict and the ways of the Israeli army military engagement has raised a lot of concern about, in a way that we know that we live in a world that values white lives more than brown lives, but the shock and horror that has come from this, I think, really demonstrates very clearly, even to people who have been skeptical of what Palestinians have to say, about how the Israelis treat civilian populations. Outside of Gaza, just to note the settler violence that has been a topic of international conversation lately, which continues unabated. But unlike the common narrative that ascribes the violence to a few radical settlers, the truth of the matter is that this is something that's being supported by and coordinated with the Israeli military itself. So we're not really talking about a group of sort of rogue actors, but rather a concerted state effort to instill terror across Palestine. There are a lot of regional impacts to discuss. I'd be happy to, in the Q&A, talk a little bit about what's been happening in Syria and in Lebanon, but instead I want to focus a little bit on what's been happening in Yemen, because there is now a new US-led international effort to stop what has been an ongoing campaign by Yemeni forces to disrupt Israeli shipping through Bab el-Mandeb, this very thin strait that allows access from the Red Sea into the Arabian Sea. This is another fascinating thing that I could spend an hour on unto itself, but just to note that another reason you're seeing a lot of pressure for a resolution in this is that that act of making shipping unsafe for Israeli shipping companies has, I think, doubled shipping costs and massively disrupted global trade in a way that people haven't really fully grappled with, I think, in terms of the public forum. So another topic for discussion, if that would be useful. And I wanted to take a moment just to acknowledge the shifting media narrative that's been happening around all of these things. If you noticed, the screen caps that I've been putting into this presentation, I've been using, very traditional Western media, not folks that generally would be considered sort of progressive in their orientation or sympathetic to Palestinian narratives historically. So I think we are seeing a really meaningful shift in the way that Western media is acknowledging the scale of atrocity and the sort of horrors that are being committed with really no justification, and the ways that the underlying justifications that had been given by the Israeli army to commit these sort of atrocities are sort of washing away, including, I think yesterday, the Washington Post put out an investigation into the claims that Al-Shifa Hospital was a Hamas command center, and basically said there's no evidence of that, which obviously people have been saying for a month now. But I'd also highly recommend watching the CNN reporter Clarissa Ward, who went into Gaza, the first Western reporter to do that since this conflict started. It's quite a powerful video. So switching over to sort of a quick analysis of the political situation, there are 2 really big UN votes that have happened in the past week. The first was a UN General Assembly vote acknowledging the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, a very milquetoast, very simple resolution that mirrored something Biden had said earlier, which was that Palestinian people have a right to self-determination. But 4 countries voted against it, which was the US, Israel, and 2 tiny Pacific Island countries. Sort of once again, like belying the sort of ways that the US government, the rhetoric doesn't match the actions. But more importantly, at the US level, I think it was the Security Council resolution, which passed today. It's something that's been discussed for quite a while now. After the US vetoed the last Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, there have been negotiations for the past week to get the US to a point, not to agree to the resolution, but to not veto the resolution, was the level at which there was international pressure to make it happen. So the language that had to be negotiated to allow for the US to allow this resolution to pass the Security Council was to drop any language about an urgent suspension of hostilities and to replace that with calling for the creation of conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities, as well as Israel had balked at the idea that the UN should inspect aid shipments. The Israelis want to themselves inspect aid shipments. They have, instituted a system for well over a decade now where they count the number of calories that go into Gaza so that they can provide the exact minimum required calories for the number of people there. So this is a sort of ongoing, like Israel doesn't want to lose any control over anything that goes into the Gaza Strip. And so with these changes, the US has abstained. Every other country voted for it except for Russia, which also abstained, but interestingly, because of the US changes, which Russia said like made the US complicit in the massacre of the Palestinian people. A lot to discuss there, but again, very little time. I want to take a moment to acknowledge a sort of popular mobilization that has been happening at the national level. We saw just a few days ago, over 80 progressive movement leaders were arrested at Capitol Hill for demonstrating about stopping military arms to Israel. Yesterday, I think, or the day before, thousands marched to the AIPAC office, accusing the American Israel Public Affairs Committee of complicity in genocide and the support of right-wing politicians and the attempt to undermine US democracy. It was a really powerful demonstration that also showed the amount of donations top Democrats have received from AIPAC. And thirdly, I just want to call out all of the labor organizing that has been happening lately, including the endorsement of a ceasefire by the United Auto Workers, which is one of the largest unions in the country. So those mobilizations, and the sort of ongoing actions around it, as well as the shifting media narrative, are really starting to shift broad popular perceptions of this conflict, where, unsurprisingly, only a third of people in the US approve of the way that Biden has been handling the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. Buried in that poll, which was produced by the New York Times, was, I think, a particularly fascinating question that used Israel's language about the justification for this war, saying Israel should continue its military campaign until Hamas is fully eliminated, even though that's like not a thing that can happen. Even when using that language, overwhelmingly people oppose the idea of that, and they support the alternate option, which is Israel should stop its military campaign in order to protect against civilian casualties. Equally interesting, and for the first time in history, the US public is against sending military aid to Israel. And this has been an ongoing shift over the past 2 months, and just as of last week, it has tipped so that more people are against it than for it. And if you look at the breakdown by party, that is, massively true for Democrats and independents. And it's really only Republicans now that are keeping the idea of sending military aid to Israel even remotely on the political agenda. given these massive shifts and given all the mobilization that's been happening, the national discourse is moving, unsurprisingly. And I think some of my colleagues will talk about this a little bit more. But the number of people who have called for a ceasefire has grown significantly. That includes, you'll see on the right there, a letter from a series of sort of moderate to right-wing Democrats that are now saying the mounting civilian death toll and humanitarian crisis in Gaza are unacceptable. And there has been a commitment by the Democratic Party to protect the Democrats that are being targeted by the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. I don't really need to get too much into the local because I think a lot of my colleagues will do that, but I do want to acknowledge that a lot of mobilization is happening here and it's having quite an impact. The ceasefire resolutions that we saw passed, in Oakland, in Richmond, and is now on the way in San Francisco, among a series of other ceasefire resolutions that are being passed at local government bodies across the Bay Area. As I understand it, the San Francisco ceasefire resolution needs to be moved out of the Rules Committee to return for a formal vote to the full San Francisco Board of Supervisors. That's happening on January 8th. So if folks are available for that, I think we really want to put the same kind of public pressure we put on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors when the motion was introduced and over 2,000 people showed up to City Hall. Please use that link to send emails supporting the resolution. Today is also an auspicious day because it is the 30,000th email that has been sent to the Board of Supervisors demanding that they support this ceasefire resolution. There's an ongoing campaign at the San Francisco Unified School District around students who are being accused of having ulterior motives or disrupting things by doing walkouts in favor of a ceasefire, an attempt to blame AROC for that in a way that's really horrific. So I do encourage you to sign that petition as well and to show up to upcoming school board meetings. I think Lily will talk quite a bit about the Bay Bridge 78, but I'll just say that they need our support and they've been getting it this week. A really powerful demonstration that has really moved things. And a lot is happening at the Senate level, both in terms of the two senators, Alex Padilla and Senator Butler, who have thus far refused to properly engage, to the extent that most of Alex Padilla's phone lines in his various offices are blocked because he is so overwhelmed with phone calls. I would encourage you to keep those phone calls coming and to continue to pressure those officials along with Pelosi and any other top level Democratic official, and to be creative with it. The calls and the emails are a critical piece of it, but anything that allows us to make sure that they hear what is happening. We're at a moment where the Israeli narrative has completely fallen apart. The scale of humanitarian catastrophe is impossible to ignore. The public opinion is squarely with the plight of the Palestinian people. And the only thing that's left for these politicians to do is try to ignore it. So to the extent that we can keep them from ignoring it, we are moving the needle. And there's been an incredible change in political discourse this past few weeks. And I think it's really incumbent on us to keep that going. And I'll end there. There's a lot more to say, I think, about upcoming Senate primaries and things, but I just want to close by saying, if you want to get involved in the Bay Area, there is a calendar of events, if you're not aware of it already, that I would encourage you to use to see what's happening in your area and to show up. And if you want to stay in touch with what AROC is working on in our main campaigns, I'd encourage you to join our text blast system. So yeah, you can just text PSA to that number and we'll be able to send you updates when we can. All right, I've taken up more than my share of time, but thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to having more conversation in the Q&A.
Thanks, Summer. Thanks so much. Next, we'll hear from Connie Cho from APEN to talk a little bit more and dive a little bit more deeply on congressional pressure. Connie, I think you're still muted.
Hello, everyone. I'm Connie from the Asian Pacific Environmental Network. I use she, her pronouns. And I want to share with you just a little bit of an update that we've received from the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights and contextualize some of the local actions that have been happening that some of you may have been a part of. And if I can just slideshow here. Great. One moment. So our first update is that Congress is actually no longer in session for 2023 and will reconvene in the new year. But if they're not in DC in session, that means they're here in California, which is exactly why we need to keep up the pressure locally. And first and foremost, the most important demand that we have had for Congress is for a permanent ceasefire. And Summer talked about the progress that we've made on that front. As we still grieve the ongoing siege on Gaza, I also want to acknowledge that it's real progress that we've been making. It's easy for this to feel like an impossible fight, but it is not. And we have the receipts. Our community has successfully pressured high priority representatives in the House into publicly supporting a ceasefire over the past couple months. At first, it was a few, a dozen, dozens, and then hundreds of residents, advocates writing in, sitting in, Zooming in, singing in, and Mark Desaulnier's offices, Rokana's offices. And we have a number of House representatives that support a permanent ceasefire. And for the representatives who have not called for a permanent ceasefire yet, we need to double down on shaming them. Let the gloves come off, get creative. We need to target Democratic leader, Representative Nancy Pelosi. I know that some folks were silently bird dogging and making their presence known at public events she was at in San Francisco this past week. Eric Swalwell in the Fremont area, Ami Bera in Sacramento. And of course, the Senate. This October, President Biden, also known as Genocide Joe, asked Congress to approve an additional $106 billion supplemental funding package that would include $14.3 billion for the Israeli genocide. And billions of dollars for border militarizations, surveillance, jailing, and deportation of immigrants. That's Border Patrol staff, Homeland Security investigations, ICE detention facilities, deportation flights. That amounted to about $8 billion in the Senate package now. Of course, it unfortunately passed, some version of this package passed in the GOP-led House. And so since then, all eyes have been on the Senate. And hundreds of people here in our community have already been making office visits, holding protests, rallies, and even sit-ins at our senators' offices. Some are faxing and sending postcards about this $14.3 billion to Israel and billions for border militarization. At Senator Padilla's office, over 50 people from Mamas for Palestine, faith community, labor leaders held a sit-in at Senator Padilla's office. And finally, healthcare workers were able to speak to some of his local district staff. We had over 100 community members speak to Senator Padilla's DC staff over Zoom as well. At Senator Butler's office, Palestinian and allied leaders from Iraq, labor unions, Alliance of South Asians Taking Action, Anti-Police Terror Project, Jewish Voices for Peace, and others have been taking meetings with local staff as well. And while they haven't called for a permanent ceasefire yet, I want to take a moment to recognize the end of the year as an important milestone. When this funding package was first announced, it seemed like a done deal, but it wasn't. The Senate wasn't able to actually bring this deal to the floor for a vote this session. And how did this happen? It's all of the work that we've been doing, all of the calls that you've been making and emails you've been sending to make it politically impossible for our senators to land the deal and bring it to a vote. On Tuesday, as Summer spoke about, 80 civil rights leaders, progressive leaders, I think over 60 were arrested, including the Council on American Islamic Relations, SF Bay Area's executive director, Sarah Ballou. They put their bodies on the line and were arrested in a direct action to physically stop the deal from being able to be brought to the Senate floor for a vote. So Biden's death deal has been stalled. And there is an increasing acknowledgement that from Congress that Israel cannot proceed with business as usual. And while it's not the same as stopping or ending military funding, senators are publicly writing to the Biden administration and negotiating behind closed doors, trying to negotiate some conditions into the funding package. Senator Warren, Sanders, Senator Van Hollen have asked for accountability in military funding and more. And we know that many folks have been using the East Bay for ceasefire now. Action Alert, it's the bit.ly CA Senator campaign, send campaign link here. But I also want to share a national bit.ly that also allows you to refer to the action, the direct action that happened on Tuesday, and also email your House rep at the same time, in addition to your senators. It is our top priority. This is coming from leadership, Palestinian leaders at the federal level. Our top priority as Californians is to demand that our senators, Alex Padilla and LaFonza Butler, call for an immediate permanent ceasefire and to end military funding for Israel's genocide. We need to demand that Senator Padilla and Senator Butler stop or vote no on this $106 billion supplemental funding package that includes the largest funding package for Israel's military in U.S. history at $14.3 billion, as it comes with no attempt at oversight or any additional conditions, despite increasing settler violence in the West Bank and an avalanche of evidence of human rights violations. So you can use this link to send an auto email. Folks around the country will be using it, and we'll be disseminating it widely. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Connie. And to emphasize again what Connie has said about how impactful everyone's actions have been, and how effective our actions are just in terms of moving the needle and slowing down the gears of war at this current moment. Speaking of those who have put their bodies on the line, we're going to hear from Lily from AROC about the Bay Bridge 78, what happened in court this week, and how we can continue our support for our comrades and friends.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here and for being here on this webinar. I'm going to just try to share some slides with you. And these are just for something pretty to look at. Okay. So again, my name is Lily. I'm with AROC. I'm also one of the 78 people who have been charged with 5 misdemeanors in connection to the November 16th action, halting traffic on the Bay Bridge. Just as context for that action, it was during the week of the Asia Pacific Economic Conference or Cooperation in San Francisco. So Biden and other world leaders were here trying to advance a neoliberal agenda. This was just before the temporary ceasefire was called. And it was also an action that really was in the tradition of third world liberation struggles, majority people of color and queer, women and gender nonconforming people. So 78 people were charged from the action. You can see that there was hundreds and hundreds of police that were present. This is a new direction in legal repression in San Francisco that we've seen recently around political action. And again, this was the APEC conference, sort of the world stage in San Francisco, and was a pet project of London Breed. And so we see the DA pressing forward, Brooke Jenkins pressing forward on these charges as part of advancing the sort of neoliberal pro-policing agenda in San Francisco that connects to all of our movements, right? Not just Palestinian liberation. These 5 charges included are some typical protest charges as well as false imprisonment. So we see Brooke Jenkins really trying to press hard against these 78 people of us. So I want to say thank you, because I'm assuming some of you on this call have already made calls to the district attorney, have shown up to court. Our arraignments were this week. So we've had, hundreds of people show up every day. I just came from court. There was probably 250 people there today to pack the court. Loud, you could hear us throughout the building. There's been power hours from a number of different organizations. We have had a press conference on the first day, and this has resulted in over 11,000 emails being sent to the district attorney's office, and 1,300 calls and voicemails. And within this, we are still committed to highlighting that our main emphasis is around this call for a ceasefire and a call to free Palestine, right? That we want to drop the charges, but we did this action as all of our work for Palestine and Palestinian liberation. And so we want to continue to hold that at the center of every action that we take to drop the charges as well. So we are still asking for calls and emails to the district attorney's office to drop the charges. As of right now, our court dates have been reset for February 1st and 2nd. And this is a movement lawyering strategy to get us all on the same court dates for our arraignments to plead not guilty together. And to advance together in this struggle, in this legal case. And so please mark your calendars for February 1st and 2nd. But more importantly, really, in the meantime, please do continue to spread the word about sending emails and making calls to DA Jenkins' office. You can do this more than once if you want. That's okay. You can keep the pressure on. We have heard that there are some calls coming from the opposite side to say, continue to press forward these charges. And we really do see this as Jenkins using this as a test case to set an example against San Francisco's long history of protest for social justice and issues locally and internationally. And we know that we are also taking action in San Francisco in that legacy as well of civil disobedience, of standing up for what is right and just, and stopping business as usual. And so we will continue to take action. We will all continue to stand up for this, and in order to also protect and defend our rights to do so, and to ensure that this strong mobilization happens in the San Francisco Bay Area for all of our movements. We're really calling people to action, to drop the charges, to call to drop the charges, and hopeful that those will be dropped before our next court date. But either way, we'll press forward and appreciate all of your support. And I think that's it from me.
Thank you, Lily. Just again, thank you to Lily and all of our friends and comrades who've put their bodies on the line in protest here and across the country and across the globe. And just to want to reemphasize Lily's call to continue to call the DA's office and push for dropping the charges and to show up for any opportunities for court support, and let our friends and comrades know that we stand behind them. We're going to hear really quickly right now from Refilwe from APTP to just talk a little bit more about more actions ahead for us in January with Reclaim Our MLK Week and the Week of Action.
Thank you for that. Good afternoon, folks. My name is Refilwe. Pronouns are she, her, hers, and my name. Community organizer at the Anti-Police Terror Project. And my access need of the moment is that I will not have my video on. I'm excited to talk to you all about our 10th annual march, Reclaim Martin Luther King's Radical Legacy March. Is not only a celebration of the life of Dr. King and the revolutionaries before us, but it is a reclamation, as in the name, of their history of being critical of U.S. imperialism, of demanding a redistribution of resources and funds that actually benefit the masses, and many of which, issues of which that we're organizing around today, that we want to highlight that our leaders of yesterday too fought this good fight, knowing that none of us were free until all of us were free. This January, on January 15th, will be this year's 10th annual march. We'll be at Oscar Grant Plaza, gathering around 11 a.m. There is a landing page, not only for the march, but for all of the events happening during the week of action, led by both APTP and community partners. Kimmy's just dropped that link in the chat, and I believe it'll be sent out to everybody after the Zoom. So the march will be that 15th, and then the 16th through 19th will be days filled with trainings and film screenings and direct actions, led by, again, community members to support other organizations and even just community members like yourselves joining in today and being able to take action during the week of action. We'll be having 2 community spokes meetings. The first will be entirely virtual, set for January 3rd. From 5 to 7. There's a Zoom registration that can be sent out to folks as well. And then we're hoping to do hybrid for the second meeting, January 10th. Still looking for in-person location that meets all of our access needs. But either way, folks can expect to join virtually to talk about our next steps in community issues across the board, and particularly how we can continue to take action together for Palestine. So hope you all can join us for those pre-week of action meetings, so that we have a very impactful week of action that week of January 15th. Hope to see you at the march and the events following, including those pre-meetings.
Thank you so much, Refilwe. And again, please follow the links to keep up to date on APTP's work and planning heading into that week of action, including their social media pages. To close us out and to help us have a more comprehensive understanding of our strategy moving forward towards this end of the year and into the new year, and how we sustain the energy, the crucial energy we need to have to take action when others may be breaking for the holiday. Our actions are not going to stop. We're going to keep the pressure on moving into the next year. And Michelle Mascarenas is going to talk us a little bit through the overarching strategy and some clear next steps.
Right on. Thanks, Thomas. Thank you all for being here. I just want to name, yesterday was the solstice. And the darkest times are when we can see the light most clearly, right? Most brightly. And so we see this happening, right? We see the veil lifting for those of us who may not have been on this particular front line, just as we have seen the veils be lifting, over the past several years and decades. We see the streets filled with young people, right? BIPOC, queer, women, GNC folks who see our struggles as linked. And even more important, maybe, that we are all connected, right? That we are all one. And like our Palestinian family has supported so many of us in understanding over generations, right? From Nelson Mandela in the struggle for liberation against South African apartheid, to Malcolm X in the struggle for Black liberation on Turtle Island, to the Gulf South post-Katrina, to Urban Shield and Cop City, and the role of the US-Israel relationship in extending what is an open-air prison in Gaza to the rest of the world, right? We see this in the rise in militarization and the attempted rise for ethno-religious nationalism. But we will win. We can see this already, and we've heard from our speakers how powerful our movement has grown, how powerfully our movement has grown in these past months. And so we will win a ceasefire. And then we've got to keep organizing, right? Palestinian people are on the front lines of this struggle, this crisis. And we want to just share with you this is a little bit of a wrap up because I know it was a lot of information. Oops, 1 second. And so this will be a little bit of a wrap up. I'm going to share the strategic arc that we have for the Bay for the next couple of months. I'll share this again at the end, and then we'll share these in the email that goes out as well. So targets, like we've heard, we've got to continue to up the pressure on the senators and congresspeople while they are out of session and in California. We've got to, secondly, call the DA in San Francisco as often as you can to drop the charges on the Bay Bridge 78. We've got to raise the visibility of Palestine and the call for a ceasefire wherever we go, right? So that means posters, keffiyehs, flags, banners, like all of it, just be putting it out there, right? That's an important sort of target is our minds, right? And our interconnectedness. Boycott, divest, and sanctions. Don't support genocide. Not at the holidays, not ever. And then tactics, right? December through January, we're going to be out in the streets on Saturday with AROC, PYM, all the other folks that are calling us out to march. We're going to continue to post our posters in our windows and all over the place. We're going to come out to faith-based and other actions that are happening, targeting senators, but and other officials, and getting our institutions to take a stand, because it's from these institutions that we control and govern that we can be pushing our elected officials, whether they're the school boards or the city councils or the senators, which the senators and congresspeople right now we've heard are super important. So those faith-based actions are an important tool for that in this next period, and there's going to be a series of them rolling out. And then organize your crew. So if you haven't been rolling with a group of folks, start prioritizing, getting your crew together to roll with in January. And because as Refuelway just named, coming up in January and then through March, we've got this week of trainings and action happening. So get ready to sign up for those trainings when they come out. And we're going to actually do a little poll right now. Thomas, will you open the poll? And then I'll just say this last thing is also January through March, we've got to support the electeds who stand for a ceasefire, like Barbara Lee, who's the only candidate running for Senate, US Senate, who has publicly stated her support for a ceasefire. All right, so you can vote for, this is single choice, but yeah, so top choice here, direct action. What direct action workshops are you interested in attending? This will help our trainers get a sense of what they should prioritize for January. So we've got action planning, scouting, action planning strategies, scouting, blockades, security and de-escalation, banner making and art, and police liaisons. So go ahead and fill that out. That will be super helpful for our trainers. And then I'm going to just go through the last couple of these slides. So the next thing we just want to name, you heard this in what Sammer and other folks have been naming, is like organize from your identity or your sector. This is a key way. Part of what I want to share is like just ways to help us not feel overwhelmed, because there's so many ways, so many beautiful ways to get involved. And so we need to focus how we use our energy and our time, right, to do that effectively. So organizing within your union is one example. As a parent, you can either join Families for Ceasefire or organize in your school district, for example, to pass a resolution, support the teachers at your kids' schools that are putting up Palestinian flags or ceasefire posters or teaching Palestine, make sure that they are protected, make sure the kids and the families, Muslim and Arab families, are protected and feel some place where they can have some safety. As healthcare workers, you can organize. I put this as a person of South Asian descent, like myself, thinking about organizing around my shared lines is an example. As a person of faith, you can organize, right? And it goes on and on. Queer, disabled, Black, Indigenous, youth. Folks are really finding their ways to organize together. So again, you'll get these slides after. I'm just going to run through these fairly quickly. There's lots of calls to action for different sectors of our economy, which is one of the places we have a lot of power. This is a beautiful trouble direct action and strategy toolkit that will also get shared. Just so many creative ways to intervene. And then I just want to give a couple tips to move from isolation and overwhelm to being part of a thriving movement, which we are and are continuing to grow. So again, pick a couple of ways that you can throw down and figure out like what are the small daily acts that you can do, and just like get those into your routine, right? Whether it's calling, making the calls to Congress people and senators, representatives and senators, sending the postcards. There's a bunch of kids postcards now happening. So if you're seeing kids around the holidays, you can get copies of those and pass those out and integrate that into your community gatherings. And then of course, organizing and participating in in-person actions. Super important, because community helps to break down the sense of overwhelm and isolation and burnout. The second is to organize. So again, find others who share the identity or want to do the same tactic as you. So I know folks are like wheat pasting around town, or talking to their neighbors about putting up posters, or just like what are the ways that we can organize to get folks to take the first step, and then they come to a march, and then they want to come to a rally, and then they want to and then every day they're calling too, right? So we got to organize our folks. People want to engage, and relationship is key to why and how they're going to engage. And it's way more fun and way more sustainable, right? And it's going to connect us into the next part of this struggle. So then the third is, of course, taking that action together. And then finally, just, also take care of yourself, check in on others, and share food, share ritual time, share time to grieve, laugh, and be human, right? Just some images of some of what's happening, right, all over the country right now. And we're seeing this at Union Square here, and other places, right? We can come together in a spirit of, real like love and solidarity, which is what this season should represent, right? And be present and make sure that Palestine is not, we're not silent during this time on what's happening to our brothers and sisters and family in Palestine. So again, here's that same slide. Again, I'll just keep it up for a second. And then just want to finally end on sharing a link to a Zoom that Annie and I are going to hold again after each of these weekly calls. We're holding a little just extra space. It's kind of like a breakout space where folks can just get connected to each other, ask your questions, see who has ideas or answers or wants to work on that same thing. So it's been a great way to just get connected. So you can click on that link and join that Zoom when we finish up here. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And thank you everyone for staying 5 minutes afterwards. Again, we'll be doing these every week. So expect another one on every Friday at noon. And please share this information with your other friends and comrades, and we will see you next week. Thank you all.